Okay, here we go. Well, good morning, everybody. And first off, let me apologize for being late. There is always a technical thing that happens with sound. It's 90% of the problem that we have on putting these on. So accept my apology. So let me start the show. That song that I played you with a couple of mistakes thrown in because I didn't get a chance to warm up is the French national anthem. It's the La Marseillaise. That was written in 1792. Now, many of you may have heard this, but I'll tell you where some of you heard it for sure. There was a movie that came out in November 26, 1942. It's a classic. People still watch it. It is called Casablanca, and that starred Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman, Paul Henry, Claude Rains, Peter Lorre. Fabulous movie. Now, in that movie, there is a place called Rick's Cafe that Humphrey Bogart owns. And a couple Germans come in there and they're singing a German song. And Paul Henry, who is a fighter of the Nazis underground, he goes over to the band and they kick in this song, La Marseillaise, and it starts with the Germans singing their song and it matches in harmony to what I just played for you now. It's a fabulous scene. Anyway, if you've never seen the movie, I recommend it. And that's a little bit of trivia for you to start off the show. Now, where the hell do you go on TV or the internet? And a guy's going to do an interview and he comes out with the horn and he plays the French national anthem. There's only one place, and that's right here. Life After Scientology, and I'm Ron Miscavige. So without any further words, let me get into the program itself. Let me throw this on the side and I'm going to put my horn away. Hang on. And I'll do a little bit of business to start off with, and that is this. This program has no sponsor, and we directly depend on people who are patrons. And you can contribute anywhere from $2 to $100 as a monthly fee. You help the ongoingness of this program, and it is very much appreciated. It's the only thing that we depend on for a little bit of financial help on it. And in conjunction with what I just said, next week, we're going to have a show for patrons only. So those of you who are patrons, you can sign in and you can have a conversation with me, and we'll just have a good time for about an hour. And that won't be on the air for, broad public consumption. It will just be for the patrons. So if you're not a patron and you've been thinking about doing it, I think this would be a good reason to do it. We can have a little fun next week. That's next week, okay? So that's some business out of the way. So let's get on with it. And as promised, I have our guest back to finish up his story. That's George White. And boy, I'll tell you, we had a hell of a time getting this thing together with the sound. You people out there who know computers, you know what I'm talking about. Even the experts out there know that you have to know a lot about this stuff to keep it going. And we tried every angle. Finally, my producer was able to get through and show started. But as I said earlier, I apologize for starting late. So here's George White. George, good morning. And thanks for coming on again.
Good morning, Ron. Yeah, and thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to express OT8, all these things that have happened to me.
All right, buddy. So why don't we work out some type of transition from last week? In other words, Do you remember what you were talking about last week so we transition properly?
Yes, I have it all down here. I think the important thing was what happened to me after I got off the free winds and got back to my job. And I was fired within 2 months after that. Now, I was a pretty competent executive. I had just done miracles for this company. So I was surprised that it happened because even I was there about 4 years, and there was a Wall Street Journal article that I had not instigated, but I had planned a strategy that led to one of the biggest contracts they ever had. It actually made the Wall Street Journal, and it helped their stock. So I thought I was pretty secure there. But when I got off the free winds, I was acting strange. I went to a business meeting, which had been set up for me, and it was a disaster. I had all sorts of things in my head from coming off the free winds. I couldn't concentrate on the business, things that were going on. And it ended up in the meeting where I was turning into a laughing stock because I was stuck on some sort of minutia in terms of two words, why and what, and I couldn't get them properly defined. So I concluded that I was in deep trouble. It got worse, and I I did a few other weird things. I wasn't paying attention to people. If there was somebody who was opposed to what I was saying, I would turn my back on them. I just changed. I guess part of the tone scale drills and people being wogs and all that just really caught up to me. And I had, as I go through later, what I went through in terms of auditing these implants was brutal. Now, whether they exist or not doesn't really matter to me because just the process of what I was going through, I felt in the end I lost about 10 to 15 points of IQ. I really did. I was unsuited for the business world. I was changed. And eventually, what happened is they just let me go. And it was not a pretty thing after I had contributed all this. Now, when I got out, I was in a situation where
Hang
I
on,
had.
George. Let me ask, what did they actually say to you when they let you go? What was the line they delivered to you?
They knew nothing of, yeah, they knew nothing about Scientology. And they never really said anything because in those days, we have a right to work in Florida. They didn't want any lawsuits. But underneath it all, I was in a political controversy. And the only thing they really said to me, which was, you're on the wrong side of the fence.
Okay.
That was basically what they said. And they couldn't say anything more because they were afraid of lawsuits.
I got that.
Yeah. And then when they let me go, they had the lawyers in there. They made sure they paid me whatever they owed me for pensions. But I became an enemy of a lot of people when I came back. I think one of the things I did, which was crazy, is I bought that $3,000 bracelet and I wore it to a meeting. Now, they never mentioned Scientology and knew nothing about it, but I have a feeling that there was some suspicion under everything that was going on. But that's what they said to me. You're on the wrong side of the fence. That's it.
Go on.
I have one thing. Ron, you had said the patron hangouts next week. Rinder's next week. So
it's 2 weeks. So
yeah.
Sorry, George. Sorry for the interruption here, but I want to correct that. The patron hangout is 2 weeks from today, because next week we have Mike Rinder coming back on to finish his story, and I want to wrap that up. So it's 2 weeks from today for the patron hangout. Sean, why don't you give them a little explanation of what we're going to do? Because I've never done one of these before, and my producer's experience with this.
Yeah, all the Patreon hangout is just a Google Hangout for the first 10 people that click the link. They just come in and have a conversation with you for an hour or so or whatever, and see how it goes. But just a perk for the patrons to, interact with you.
Okay, you say it's only 10?
Yeah, first 10 people.
So
yeah.
if they hang up, somebody else can get back.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so it's going to be more than 10 because I don't know if they'll stay on for the whole hour.
Right,
So
exactly.
if they hang up, then you can get on. Anyway, I wanted him to explain that because I actually have never done that before. So it'll be the inauguration of that particular thing in this program 2 weeks from now, and next week, Mike Rinder. George, sorry to interrupt that. Getting back to now, you bought the bracelet, and by the way, that OT bracelet, that's like about 4 pounds. I mean, whatever arm you're wearing, it's going to get stronger just from carrying that around, isn't it? I mean, it's a hunk of.
Yeah, I still have it. I still have it. Actually, I don't know what I'm doing with it, but I still have it. I'll wear it. I think I'll wear it just for kicks.
Okay.
But anyway, I was in a peculiar situation because after OT8, I'll get into it later. I had just about given up on L. Ron Hubbard. I met that contradiction, and you saw the slide that he showed there of original Buddhism, and that's kind of what was going through my head: is how does this fellow turn himself and compare original Buddhism to Scientology? That's impossible. But I'll get into the details of that later. The pertinent thing is that I went over to the Miami org, and they were not very happy to see me. That one there, I'm thinking to myself, how could L. Ron Hubbard possibly compare himself to original Buddhism? Original Buddhism only lasted 100 years. It's a very, very specialized form of Buddhism. You have to understand Sanskrit and Pali to even know what he said, because Buddhism just changed and evolved after the first 100 years into almost unrecognizable branches. I mean, it split, and it was just incredible to me. But I was going over to the Miami org, and I was not well received as an OT8, and I was wondering why. And I think the reasons is that there were just strange stories coming about the ship. But they still needed me. They still needed me as an auditor. And what happened was they were trying to sell a dentist a package up in Fort Lauderdale. So they said, would you go out and talk to this dentist?
Hold it, George. When you say they were trying to sell the dentist a package, we should explain that to the audience.
Yeah,
I know what you're talking about. But okay, a package would be several different levels of the bridge. Maybe it would be auditing to get you up to grade 4, and that would include then you could include the clearing course. That's another package, and then the OT course up to OT3. That could be considered OT3 package. And they do these when they feel that they can get people for quite a bit of money, because a package like that is going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars. So that's what he meant by package. Sorry to interrupt, but I want to make sure our audience tracks with this on this, George.
No problem. Okay. So I went up to see this dentist, and I was with him for a couple of hours. His wife was there. He asked me a few questions. I never met the man, but I was walking in there with this prestige as an OT8. I got back to Miami, and a couple of days later, I get a check for $856. And I'm saying, I didn't arrange for this. And I called the org, and they said, well, he had designated you as FSM. And I said, really? I said, all I did was answer a few questions. And they said, yep, you're entitled to the money. And I said, well, I'm going to give it back because I didn't really do anything. And they said, no, you can't give it back. You have to keep it, and you're his FSM. So the light turned on. There is money in this Scientology. And I'm thinking, hey, I just went through all of this. I can actually make this money real quick. And so I said, somebody said to me, well, what about a mission starter package? Well, the mission starter package, they had, as soon as they got wind of that, they called me and they said, we have got a returned mission starter package where somebody bought it, and it's a return, and we're going to give it to you for a couple $1,000. And I said, really? I said, well, I'll start a mission. So I started a mission. And the only reason I was starting a mission is because I saw the money in this.
Yeah.
I said, I saw the money. And so I started a mission, and I went out. They started giving me referrals. I went up to Fort Lauderdale, met with another dentist, and he gave me 400 something dollars to audit his son, which I spent a couple of hours auditing his son. And it was so successful, he called me back and said, come back and do it again. I met some other people. I was making money. I ran into another auditor, and we sort of formed a partnership. I got a retail space, and I was really moving. I actually had income, and it was like I couldn't believe how easy it was to make money in Scientology. But a few things happened where there were some issues in the birth of my son. Not just some issues, some major issues. And the other thing is, it was wearing on me because I was getting these phone calls at 2 o'clock in the morning wanting to know what my stats were. I had to make all these graphs. You want to tell them what stats are?
Oh, for God's sake. No, it's a point of, you take one point in time and then another point later in time, and you see what, let's say we're talking about stats in income. What would be the statistic in your income, let's say on Monday at 2 o'clock? The next point would be Tuesday at 2 o'clock. And did the income go up or did the income go down? And that would be your statistic. It's as simple as that. And they're manic on this in Scientology. They just press that out, especially for money. As a matter of fact, you mentioned earlier that they wouldn't take that $800 and some check back. Believe me, you'd have no trouble for them taking it back these days. That was a little bit of a different case in that time. So that's what it's statistic. It's just measuring a volume or a quantity or a number at one time and taking it a little bit later and see did that number or quantity go up or go down. And
right.
They will call you at any time of the day or night, and that's a fact.
So the statistical thing was getting onerous, and I just thought, well, the money's really good. I've got a partner. We're doing some auditing with some people, but I've got some personal issues I've got to take care of. And I decided to go back into the transportation industry, which is where I was, and start a consulting firm. And so I said, well, I'm going to do that. And that thing took off even faster. That was going better than the Scientology. So I dropped the mission. And I said, I didn't really want to do this because I'm planning on getting out of Scientology anyway, because I think that ultimately Hubbard he's contradicts himself. There's no way I can accept Scientology after reading that bulletin. So I went into the transportation business and stayed in there for a while. And then years pass, and I get this call from, and I've not done much in Scientology. I've just, years pass, and I get a call one day from Professor Hugh Urban at Ohio State University, and he says, I got you off the internet. You're an OT8. I said, yeah, I did OT8. That was I think in 1988. He said, do you remember the student briefing? I said, oh, I remember that to the letter. And he said, well, Scientology has trashed it in a sense. He didn't use the word trash, but he says they've said that this is not a valid piece of their policy or their doctrine or their dogma. And I said, hell no. I said, I can tell you word for word almost, but even after all these years, what was in that document. And he said, is that the one that says Jesus was a pedophile? And I said, no, I don't remember the word pedophile. I said, but I do remember he said that Jesus was a lover of young boys and men.
Mm-hmm.
And we checked the policy, and that's what it was. And so, he got the proof that, yes, I had been there. And up until that time, the church would have nothing to do with it. Now, I went on.
George,
and
hang on.
Yeah.
I have a note here on Fishman. Did he have anything to do with it at that time?
He had a lawsuit, and there was a thing called, what had happened is that Fishman sued the church. So the church lawyers wanted all of the OT materials. So the church passed all these OT materials. When they got to that Antichrist document, during I guess they call it pre-search for a trial. The lawyer said, this is unbelievable. We can't, what is this? And so they got back to the church, and the church at that time said, take that out of the OT materials. So that document was separated out, and it was renounced by the church that it had never, ever been issued. And I was sitting there saying, yes, it's been issued. I remember reading that. I mean, how many times? That's it. There is no doubt in my mind. So he called me, and that's when I started getting back into looking at the Church of Scientology. But the specific moment, and I think I've mentioned this to you many times, I didn't care about the Antichrist. People talked to me about it, and it was not a big thing to me because I had all these courses in theology, philosophy, religion, metaphysics, you name it. And we went over that Antichrist data. And even the thing about Jesus is the pedophile didn't bother me because we had been over that specific biblical doctrine where I think the origin of it is Jesus comes out of a grove wearing a loincloth or something. And there's an implication that he's been with little boys or something, which we went over that scripture, and it's not a big deal to me. But what really got me, and where I ultimately turned against Hubbard and Scientology, was his reference to original Buddhism, where he said that he was trying to synthesize all of religion into one Scientology. Blavatsky was trying to do the same thing. And he makes a statement in there where he says, only Scientology, with its implants and engrams and all these other things, is superior to all religion. And the only one the only two religions on planet Earth that do not lead to a decline in consciousness are original Buddhism and Scientology. So he's throwing out Christianity. Now, at that point in time, I said, this man knows nothing about religion. Because as I mentioned before, original Buddhism is it's a horse of a different color. It only lasted 100 years. You can't really.
George, are you saying that Buddhism as we would know it today, although I'm not a Buddhist and I've never studied it, but I know of it, are you saying Buddhism today is different than it was in the first 100 years?
Yes, it was. And the thing is the Buddha, after the Buddha died, and then 100 years later, there was a big council. And that's when Mahayana Buddhism and all the other Buddhisms started. And the current translations of original Buddhism come from Rhys Davis, who was with his wife translated in the first Pali Sanskrit dictionary. And it has been found in the last 30 to 40 years that most of the words were incorrectly translated for original Buddhism. So to answer your question, there are 10 different flavors of Buddhism today. And the original one is it's very strict. It's very specific in what he says. And I give you an example. It's not commonly known because Mahayana Buddhism has taken over, that in the first 100 years, there was no impetus to form or create other Buddhas. It was not even in the equation. All he was doing was creating what are called arahants, which are basically saints. They're basically breaking bonds. All these words were never translated. And I think that when Hubbard makes that assumption where he says, you're going to take all these implants that I have come up with, the emanator, the sloth, the joiner, the haver. I will get into some of these later when I get into how I ran OTA. But he's saying that is all superior to original Buddhism. And then he makes a statement that says, well, the original Buddha was on to these implants, which is absurd. Then he makes a statement and says that I was the original Buddha's teacher. He does that on he did that when he said he was. Then he says he was Maitreya. That was not part of original Buddhism. I mean, there's so many contradictions. And one of the funniest things he says is one of the key concepts of original Buddhism is a word called Dhamma, which has 10 different translations. And Hubbard says, right in his text, he says, there's 10 translations of that word. I can give you an 11th or 12th. It doesn't really matter what it means. I mean, he's just out to lunch. He's off the charts.
We can conclude that even though I think L. Ron Hubbard was a brilliant man, he was an expert at making things up.
Yes, absolutely. And that's really what when we get to implants, we're going to see that. I got a perfect example of that right here. One of the implants that I ran on OT8 was called the emanator. Okay, what L. Ron Hubbard describes the emanator as.
George, I feel bad I'm interrupting you all the time, but I don't know if we've ever explained that. Could we just give a brief explanation of what an implant is, or do you want me to do it, or what?
No, you do it. Go ahead. I want to hear yours.
Well, when we're referring to an implant, we're talking about a person, a spiritual being overwhelmed with force, or maybe knocked unconscious. And while being overwhelmed by force or being knocked unconscious, is given certain commands that he would then follow when he comes out of this particular unconscious state or overwhelmed by force. And that would be how you would implant a person. I mean, you could do it by beating somebody with a club, knocking them out and saying, "You're no good." And that would be a form of an implant. Whereas when the guy came to, he'd have this phrase in his mind thinking he's no good, and he'd start dramatizing being no good.
Right.
I don't know if that's enough, but that's enough for our story here. But just so anybody who's listening, maybe for the first time, or you don't know what an implant is, there's just a brief little...
yes, and I'll add one more thing for the OT8 level, because this was drilled in, is the important point for the OT8 level is that these implanters had electronics down to a fine art unimaginable. And that's the most important thing, because what you're looking for is, you're not looking for some crude little thing. You're looking for a machine of some sort, or a wave of some sort. That's all it is. But there's this one called the emanator, and it's basically a piece of, as Hubbard describes it, it's a piece of radioactive material hung in space that just emanates, like light comes out of it, or beams come out of it, or whatever. That is, you were saying before about how he could make things up. If you go into occult literature in Blavatsky, or even beyond Blavatsky, go into any occult literature you want to go to, you're going to find the emanator. You're going to not going to find that. You're going to find emanations is talked about constantly. So what Hubbard is doing, and I've seen this in every one of his books, he'll take a concept out of the occult, like emanations, and he'll turn it into an emanator. He'll make a machine or something that actually does it to you, and then he'll change the details. He does that over and over and over again. This is where we got into auditing, and I know people want to hear this, and I'll preface it because the last time I went into this, which was on the Scientology message board, they had to shut it down. So I hope nothing happens to this show. I think it's many years. This is one of the reasons I've waited so long to actually talk about it, because there was so much flack coming out from former Scientologists. Nobody wants to hear this. There's many reasons for that, and I'm not going to get into it. But you get these implants that are run, and the CS comes down, and this is the other point. When the CS comes down on OT8, you've waited so long, you're going on to the free winds, you're sitting there, you think that the CS is going to be something specific. People get upset about this. It was not specific.
Okay, all right, George, and again,
CS, yeah.
CS, case supervisor. That's the person who, when you do your auditing session, that person will read it and then give you instructions as to what to do next, or whether you screwed up or whether it was good. So that's a case supervisor, and we will refer to them as the CS.
Right. So I get onto the ship and I read this CS. It's very generic and it's not specific at all. What it basically says is take your e-meter, scan through your dynamics, which we went over before. Those are the life urges, the individual self, sex, group, etc. Find the one that reads the most, and then go after these implants using whatever technology you have gotten from your studies. Now, here's where you asked me to stop, because you're going to go through and you're going to give a little generic explanation of these techniques or technologies, but the CS was open-ended, and that has to be really, you are on your own at that point. The CS is telling you, you do it. Here's your guidelines.
So the CS is telling you, you go through the dynamic urge to survive as yourself. That would be the first dynamic. The second dynamic would be the rearing of children, and you and your wife and raising a family. You're hoping that that survives. That's a dynamic urge to make that survive. The third one would be as part of a group, which could be as part of musicians, or maybe if you're a ditch digger, that would be a group, or an attorney, that would be another group. The fourth urge to survive would be through all of life, that is the human race. And the fifth one is all of life, which is, animals, plants, everything that grows, that's not human, all right? And then the sixth one would be the urge to survive as part of the physical universe. You want this planet to continue, so we have a place to live and play games. And then the seventh one would be the urge to survive as part of spiritual forms. You as a spiritual life force, you want all spirits to survive. And then the eighth dynamic, in Scientology, it's not a deity or a god or like a universal mind. It's infinity. So that would be like the hoping that everything continues to go on into infinity, and not a god. So those are the 8 ways that they've divided up life. So when you scan through them, you could just think about which one. And on the e-meter, if you see a little fall or a movement of the needle, which is called a read, then you would take up that particular dynamic. I don't know if I've made that plain enough.
Yeah, you got it right. That's correct. Okay. And I'll mention this thing about needle reads, because I got perfect needle reads all the way through. Maybe because I was a believer at that particular point in time. I drank too much Kool-Aid. I don't know. But my meter was jumping around. And I think I describe it. It was like a Porsche. It was like driving a sports car. I had no problem with the e-meter. I was banging back and forth and reading, and it just got into almost an accelerated form of auditing. But it doesn't bother me to say this. I'll just, because I think it'll help people. I think for most people, you're going to get the second dynamic, the sex dynamic, to read. I know that's what read for me, and that's what most people probably get first. I know other people don't, but in my particular situation, that's what happened. And I'll get into what happened there. Is so I get this long read on the second dynamic. So I go into the second dynamic. I start looking for reads, and the first implant that I find is one called the obsession. All right. And now it's not really called the obsession. You're not going to get somebody that says the obsession, but because you've studied so hard before OTA, you can recognize it by what's going on. Now, where this is coming from, I'm not going to get into, because I ultimately believe that it's a figment of Hubbard's imagination that he created. But whether or not it's faith or whatever it is, it read. Okay, so then what you do is you go through this and try to desensitize it. All right. Now you're going to get another one that's going to come in there, which is very sexually oriented. You're going to get the haver, which is another one of his created implants. So you're going to desensitize that. You get the emanator. You're going to desensitize that. Now what happens, and this is the way that it's supposed to work, as you desensitize these things, you get a sense of relief. And you say, oh, well, I feel better. And then you get the floating needle. And so that's what happened to me, and I'm saying I'm not defending him, I'm not advocating him. I understand how he created all of these things. All I can tell you is that the needle ran, and I got the floating needle, what they call the FN, which is when it floats, that means you're experiencing some sense of relief. Now, in the auditing sequence, what that means is you can move on to your next dynamic. So you move on to your next dynamic, and now you start to look at the OT8 materials, because he did a very peculiar thing. The genetic entity, which we went over the last time as the definition, that's that little guy that lives in your stomach. You're not supposed to audit him. But L. Ron Hubbard, for some strange reason, and probably I went into it in some of the other tapes, my theories of why he did. He said, well, you got to audit this thing. Okay. So this thing starts to come up. And what he says is he's looking for genetically pure bodies so that he can come back and be born and actually have better sex than the rest of us. Now that's a joke, but anyway, nobody's laughing at that one. But you have to get into this genetic entity. Now, there's all these stupid ones in genetic entity, but what did come up was what's called bodies in pawn. Now, you want to explain bodies in pawn?
Well, before I get into that, people listening, you realize that all of this could be you're taking what he's saying and you imagining it. And when you're running it, you're running out what you imagined. And once you review that a few times and desensitize it, you then get relief. But it's from your own imagination. Do you realize that that possibility exists?
Yes. Okay. That's what it is, really. Yeah.
So so we're not doing a puff piece on Scientology.
Yeah.
I will say that I think Hubbard was brilliant, and he did say a few things that are very brilliant, but what he said that is good compared to the bad is far overwhelmed and outweighed by the bad. So just take that in mind. Getting back to bodies in pawn, it would be like this: like you're here on planet Earth, and maybe on some distant planet, and you have a line, a spiritual line to a body that is in a vat of a fluid that's keeping that body alive. And what they do to that body, you think it's being done to you because you have a telepathic line or a spiritual line to that body. So that body is being kept in pawn, and it's a way of controlling you or giving you pain or different feelings and stuff. And you don't know where this is coming from, but it's coming from that body that they have at another place. Look, I feel a little bit idiotic saying this because as far as the mind is concerned, I guess anything is possible. But think about this now, that you would have a line. Okay, if you had a telephone call from somebody 2 blocks away, they're going to control your life. You hang up on them. Say, fuck you. You know, it's you. So the body in pawn, you get to believe this enough, and then it will affect you. But it's you affecting you, thinking that thing is affecting you.
Yes.
You could end the whole thing and saying, you know what? Screw it.
Right.
It's over. Right.
It's over. And the thing about Hubbard and the thing about OT8 is you eventually get to the point of what I would call universal symbols, signs, or archetypes, is that you finally come to realize that as specific as he gets into these things, that it actually goes back to Plato, that really there's a world of ideas that you're really looking at. And that's kind of how I got through it, is to say, Hubbard is constantly talking about these evil beings that are doing all this implanting, that are actually making slaves of people. And that's the thing about OT8. You're dealing with slavery. There isn't, if you go read History of Man, which we haven't talked about much except for these implants, he talks about slavery. The status of a person on Earth is a slave. And you are a slave to these implants. You're a slave to these other people. You've got bodies in pawn. You have electronics to a fine source. So you're trying to get a sense of relief out of this. Now, the big thing about genetic entity is most of those incidents that he gives you in History of Man are so minor, it's just unbelievable. Like photon converter, you got a cell doing this, and most of those don't come in. And the other thing is the Piltdown Man was nothing but a joke. Everybody knew that that was a fraud. But you know, I mentioned this before. The Theosophists really set the stage for History of Man. Charles Leadbeater. And these people, and I looked up the date, it was 1913 that that book was published, 2 years after Hubbard was born.
Wait, what book?
Man Whence Whither. Man Whence Whither by Charles Leadbeater. 1913, I looked it up.
Okay.
Okay, now, what they were doing, the Theosophists, was exactly what Hubbard did in 1952 with History of Man. They got together a group of people who were Theosophists. And by the way, there were some weird Theosophists. If you go back and read all that literature, Blavatsky had talked about the occult. And the occult of Blavatsky really lays the basis for what Hubbard did. But it was weird. There were some weird things in there. She had her 7 races, which Hubbard eventually changed into the 4th and 5th invaders. He just changed the word race into invader, and he changed the characteristics of what these people were doing. So when Hubbard was doing this History of Man in 1952, he said the same thing. He pulled together hundreds of PCs and collectively found all of these implants, and they checked out on everybody. Well, the type of people who were going into Scientology in the 50s were born and bred of that occult generation. They were thinking about life having started on Earth 70. They were arguing, is it 70,000 or 72,000 years?
Yeah.
They were doing all this. And they were talking about all these biblical things. Like there's that book of Enoch, I think, is the biblical thing with all the Titans and all the different things. They were talking about giants living on Earth. They were talking about civilizations living on Earth. The same things that Hubbard was talking about. So when Charles Leadbeater got his group together, and they used the same thing, knowingness. They didn't use science. They said, whatever comes up in my head is going to go into that book. Wow. And if you read that book, it's weird. It's totally weird. And it's the same way where Hubbard had no scientific basis. The Piltdown Man was a total fraud, but he was getting the agreement of what these people who were coming in 1950, and these people were born and bred of Blavatsky. So yeah, they were just doing that. So that's where History of Man really comes from. But then what happens is you on OT8 is he gives you so much to do that you're almost overwhelmed, because he's now saying you got to go back and you got to look at this point in time where Xenu is setting off the explosion, and these idiotic morons from outside the mess universe are messing with your DNA or your genetic entity. I'm using them interchangeably. So you got to go there, and you've got to do that. And so you go back to OT3 and you rerun that on OT8 again and try to get whatever that point is. Well, however you're going to do it, I did it. Then you get into the genetic entity, you get the bodies in pawn, and then to really handle the genetic entity, what comes up at that point in time is bodies first fighting bodies, which is a rare thing, but that's what exactly comes up on OT8. And that is that Hubbard talks about a point in time where you didn't get thetans fighting thetans. It was actually bodies, genetic entities fighting genetic entities, or bodies and bodies. So you have to run all that out. Now, there's one more thing that you have to do, and that is you have to go into the predictions, and you sort of have to clear that out. And then what happens is once you go through all of your 8 dynamics, you eventually get to one point where the auditing accelerates. And what I mean by that is you're just running these archetypes. You're running these symbols. You're running these signs. You're running hatred. You're running as a symbol of a motivator of the universe. You're running hatred. You're running evil as an entity. And you run all these things, and it just goes, at that point in time, it goes real fast. And then you eventually get to the point where everything just floats all over the place, and you say, I'm done. Now, how long did that take? I think in my case, I think I was in there 4 days, if I don't remember, but not the whole day, maybe 6, 8 hours a day. So, and I'll make another comment about truth revealed, because people talk about that, and they talk about amnesia on the whole track. And then I'll talk about the unprompted end of it, and then we'll be done with it. But
okay, but wait, before you go on, you said you run these things. What do you mean by running them?
Going back and forth in time. In other words, starting at the beginning, going through it, and then desensitizing it.
Okay.
And you can do that in many different ways. You can do that with any technique that he came out. Now, should I mention the techniques, or you want to get into that?
I'll tell you, I think we're going to get too technical.
Okay, good. That's fine.
When you're talking about techniques, there's many different ways that you can run these things. But in the final analysis, they're all ending up with the same end product after you do it. So, there's many ways that you can fix a car. Well, go to a mechanic, and he can use all of his technologies to change the tire, change the oil, fix the transmission, but whatever, you're talking about a technique, and the techniques are divided into many different things, and that's how you would, that's how
right.
Okay.
Okay. Now, he talks about getting rid of amnesia on the whole track, and that turns out to be a misnomer, because you can't get rid of amnesia on the whole track. What he really means by that is that if you put enough work into it with an e-meter, you can pretty much discover whatever you want, and you're clear in that sense. It doesn't mean that you can sit there and recall it just doesn't mean that. And the other thing,
it also could mean that you're using an e-meter and coming up with something in your imagination, thinking that it's real also.
Correct. And that's exactly how it works.
Yeah.
Now, truth revealed, he doesn't reveal really truth revealed. And I'll tell you why. This is what I finally concluded. In theory, and I'm talking theoretically, logically, and what his religion is all about. He throws out Jesus. He throws out Kant, and he claims that he was present. What's that?
No, I'm saying something to my producer here.
Okay. He throws out Kant, and he says, I was present at his lectures in the 19th century, which is BS.
Yeah.
He throws out Einstein, all right, and he throws out anybody and he throws out Socrates. Now, I did some analysis of this, and it's just impossible for him. He is not giving you any truth revealed. If anything, he's giving you the contradiction revealed, because the contradiction is he's throwing out all these key people, and then he's claiming that these implants supersede all of them. Jesus, Kant, Einstein, Buddha, all of them. And it's impossible. And then his ultimate contradiction is, for some reason, he decides he's got to ally himself with the original Buddha because he's kicking out Christianity. But it doesn't work, because Scientology is so foreign, as we went over that, to Buddhism, that you end up with the contradiction revealed. That's exactly what you end up.
Okay,
now,
so wait, before we go on, George, are you saying that the truth revealed is the implants are the thing, not the philosophers? Is that was that the truth revealed?
That is what the truth revealed is. The truth revealed is not one specific word. It's the framework of the implants, the hatred of the implanters, the evil in the universe that exists. It's all those things. It's not one specific thing. It's all those things. That's the truth that you get. And the truth is his truth. You see, it's not my truth. It's not my truth. It's his truth, but that's his truth revealed. That's what you get.
Wow.
Now, I'm going to give you the unprompted attestation, or I forget what you call that, where you have to go and prove something. But anyway, here's the way it worked. You could not go into there and have them in any way hint to you what the truth revealed was. It had to be unprompted. All right. That's how the original OT8 was. Now they've changed that. But what they meant by unprompted is that after you went through all the auditing, you had to go into the examiner. That's it, the examiner. Okay. And she or he could not prompt you. If you didn't know it, you were sent back. Period. End of story. And it was not just, oh, I feel good. You had to come out with specific words to pass the level. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or else you went back, and it was unprompted. So I went through all of this. I'm feeling pretty good. I go in to see the examiner, and she says, yeah, okay, this is unprompted. I'm not going to tell you anything. And she says, what I want you to do is tell me what the end phenomenon of OT8 is. And then here's a demo kit. Yeah, I think we went over demo kit. You have to demo it. Okay. So I sit there and I say, because they hadn't told me it was unprompted. And I say, well, basic, and I know that Hubbard is full of beans in his contradiction, but I'm not going to say anything about that because I want to get off the ship at this point. I know that they can hold me on the ship. I want my passport.
Right.
And so now I turn into a Hubbardian, right? You see, because I'm not who I am. You get that. I'm an actor.
Yeah.
I'm an actor at this point in time. So I say, all right, this is, I said, first of all, there's a Thetan. And I said, first of all, the Thetan has no mass, no meaning, no mobility, no motion. He's a static. And that, and all of the traditional things about what a Thetan is. And then I say, secondly, there, and I'm demoing it out as I'm doing it. I'm showing all these different things, and I get say, well, there is evil in the world, and this evil has reached massive proportions, and to end the slavery of the people on planet Earth, I figured this is what they want to hear. To end the slavery on planet Earth, that you have to continue to go up the bridge, okay? And that there are still more levels beyond this. And she just throws her hands up in the air and, you got it, you got it, you got it. And I'm thinking, I got what? You got the answer. You pass. I said, oh, terrific. I just passed OT8 unprompted.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So now what you thought was going to be is that you took the handcuffs off and you were free.
Yes.
But they said, good. Now there's more handcuffs you got to take.
There's no more handcuffs.
So there's no end to this.
There's no end to this. See, all the time I was doing OT8, even before I ran into his contradiction or got that out, I was looking for these OT powers he was talking about. Because, History of Man, he talks about moving objects, going exterior, all this other stuff. And there was no sign of it. Now, granted, I can't knock the fact that I felt good.
Yeah.
Because I do believe, and I'll maintain this down to the core, is that if you sit down on an isolated ship after paying all that money with this meter and you concentrate on all these things, you're gonna you're gonna find something out about it. So my battery's running low. I got to plug this in, but I'll do that. This will take 1 second. Here we go. Hold on 1 second. All right, now we get this going. All right, we should be good. There we go. I had to change power sources, but that I didn't. So I'm coming off the ship. I put all this money into it, which wasn't that much for me, but for other people, it's absolutely ridiculous. And I just look at these people now about what OT8 has become, and it doesn't even get into that. all they're talking about is something like, well, I feel better and I know I'm not going to get worse. And, I've reached sort of a little bit of a serenity. And, by the way, if you really look at that thing, serenity of beingness, which Hubbard calls tone 40 and the top of his bridge, I mean, that's, if you take the fact that there's 8 different levels of meditation, that's probably level 1 or 2, serenity of beingness. That's how quickly that whole thing. So, you're looking at doing some meditation, you can get to that serenity of beingness in maybe a couple of months of training, and it's not going to cost you a lot of money. Yeah. So that was the other thing, is Hubbard with his money, thinking that everything that he had was so valuable when it really wasn't. And you now get to superpower a little bit, because you do superpower on OT8, the original OT8, because now I've never done the superpower at the church here, but I've read how they do it. They've got that chair and they move you around. You're doing that on the original OT8, so you're getting a twofer, right? Mm-hmm. Because most of the implants that he's running are in History of Man. I think there's one called a jiggler, a runner, a mover. They're all messing you up. So you're doing superpower on OT8, just to show you how, if you wanted it, you could have it.
But in other words, let's finalize this if we could. I think we've done it already, but just to put the cherry on top of the ice cream. You're basically saying that at the end of all of this, all the money you spent, all the auditing, after you've done the level called OT8, you then say, now I know I have to continue up the bridge?
Yeah, that's one of the things they're looking for. Yeah.
Well, not one of them. Didn't the examiner say you got it?
Yeah, she did say that, but she never said that. She said, I got it, and I said a lot of things. So
but
maybe
they let you attest, though, right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Okay, yeah. But you did mention that you ran these things and you audited and did this and that, and you said, look, I know I have to go up the bridge.
Yes, because there were no superpowers. There was no exteriorization. There was no, I knew, because I had the same feeling on OT3. I had the same feeling on OT2, OT1, unclear. Well, where is this? Where are the things you're talking about? I'd like to mention this, Iamb Blickus, if you could throw that slide up there. I don't remember which one it was, but if you got your notes there.
Yeah, Iamb Blickus is number 5.
5, yeah, just put 5 up there.
You can't. I can't. Sorry, George, I can't. The screen's frozen.
Oh, the screen's frozen. All right, I'll just talk about him. He's just an old philosopher, but he lived in about 214 AD. And when I was doing my research, I was trying to find something that was related to Scientology, and it's in the old ancient world. It's very hard, because most of those books were burned. All those book burnings and inquisitions, they went down the tubes. But Iamb Blickus was a cult leader in about 214 AD, and I think he lived until he was 80. But such an interesting comparison. He was Gnostic. He was Neoplaton. He was known for his magic, and there's no specific record of what he did in his magic, but there were kings that called him over and he did his magic. And he was one. He wrote a book called Egyptian Mysteries, and he talks in there. I read that book, and he is one of the first people that's talking about directing a body from an exterior position. In other words, he doesn't say exterior with full perception. He doesn't say that, but he does say that the spirit is directing the body from outside. And the thing about Iamb Blickus is that he's the very first one that I can trace that had an inkling of what Scientology was all about, to where Hubbard would eventually come up with this thing called knowingness, which is kind of a false indicator. And I think that that's probably one of the things that's wrong with the current church today, is you have the church's leader today who really doesn't follow Hubbard. I mean, he doesn't follow the original OT8. He doesn't follow the doctrine. It was invalidated. It's gone. And what he's relying on is this thing called knowingness, where it's a subjective reality that is really all it comes down to. And I think that that's why it's such a hard thing to dissolve this church, because it's based on this idea of knowingness. It's based on this idea of subjective reality. Hubbard's contradictions are unbelievable. He throws out Socrates. Okay, one of the most important things that Socrates ever said was, if you're viewing the world through your senses, you're blind. That's a direct quotation from Socrates. Now, here's Hubbard throwing them out. Now, why did he say that? Well, because really, in his school of thought, all we have are these universal ideas. And so that's what you're supposed to focus on. You're supposed to focus on justice. You're supposed to die for justice. You're supposed to do all these things. And by the way, Blavatsky, and nobody knows if Blavatsky is accurate, but she says a lot of things. And one of the things she says is that really this started with Pythagoras. And Pythagoras's grandfather, a man named Lamprias, was the first person in ancient Greece to ever go exterior. And so this whole life continuum starts there. And she also says something interesting about Pythagoras, is the mathematics was a sideline. And eventually what happened, he was run out of Dodge and actually physically assaulted or maybe even murdered, although they don't even know, because he got into trouble with his cult. It was nothing more than a cult at that particular point in time. But all of these people, Plato, Socrates, they're all talking about past lives. They're all talking about a life continuum. They're all talking about a soul migrating. They're all talking about these things. And Hubbard is rejecting all of them and coming up with this thing called knowingness, which it doesn't hold water.
No, yeah. I got that. And then, so I think the main thing about this program was to get to OT8, what it takes and what you get out of it. And if it can be boiled down to the fact that now you know that there's more to do, because I've heard other versions that in the recent one, and I've heard this from people who would know, that you come to realize that you've been auditing entities and it wasn't you. So now you're back to where you were before you ever walked into a Church of Scientology. That's one of the reasons. That's one of the versions I hear today. But when you did it, it was knowing that you ran all the processes and you know that there's more to do.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that a correct summarization of it?
Yes. And you put in all this work. And as a matter of fact, I mentioned the Philadelphia doctorate course tapes because that fits in to OT8 itself. And I didn't mention it, but it's important. Those are 1952 where he did his doctorate thing. And I actually made extensive notes. But for people who are interested in pursuing this, there's one particular lecture on the 10th of December, I think it's 1952, the evening second hour, where he gets into the OT8 material, because he tells you, you have to look at that. And that's basically, it fits in with the implants, because he has these thing called ridges. And he says, I think there are 18 of them. And he does this drawing where he shows all of the impact areas around your forehead, the back of your head, your neck. And he makes these lines and shows it all. And, I always said that he evolved into Lucifer. And I do believe that. I do believe that as far as Lucifer exists, if he does, and I believe that there is, again, an archetype, Lucifer, that he evolved into Lucifer. And I read, I really believe that. And one of the things that struck me was in Milton's Paradise Lost, and this is so important to me for getting out of Scientology. God sends a seraphim, which is sort of like a modern day helicopter gunship. I mean, these things are unbelievable. I can't get the screen, but in order to get rid of Lucifer, the seraphim delivers an electronic blow to L. Ron Hubbard's head, or to Lucifer's head. Lucifer takes 10 steps back and drops to one knee. And it occurred to me that in this lecture on December the 10th, 1952, Hubbard is actually drawing out on his head the impact of that blow. Now, I don't believe that ever happened, but it's another thing. It's a symbology. It's a symbol of what is going on with good and evil.
Yeah.
Hubbard takes, and then the other thing is Hubbard has a lot of implants where you're cut with swords or cut with electronic beams. And then the second part is that Saint Michael in Paradise Lost comes out and he has a sword that is more powerful than Lucifer's, and he slices Lucifer in half on the right side. Now, Lucifer doesn't die because he's immortal, but he first feels pain. And so the thing is that, from a universal standpoint of the greatest Western literature that exists, we've always had this battle between the divine and evil. And this is not, Hubbard is nothing more than a developed Lucifer through his own means.
That is in his own mind, at least.
In his own mind, yes.
Okay. So I think we've captured the essence of what we wanted to do with this, which would be the end result of what you get on OTA. But you also mentioned one other thing, and I want you to talk about it just for a minute because we are running out of time. And you mentioned about a cult within a cult.
Yes, that is current Scientology. And I'll tell you why. It is a cult within a cult because your David Miscavige, who I apologize to you for almost throwing him overboard, and I sincerely mean that. I can't say that often enough how much that bothers me. But yeah, he threw out the original OT8 material. It's no longer existent within the church. So those people who are in the church are within a cult that is formed by him. And the walls around the cult that he has formed are his knowingness, because he doesn't understand Scientology. So he has really created a cult within a cult. There is no way that these people are getting the true essence of L. Ron Hubbard. They can read these books 100 times over. They can read the film. They're not getting it because it doesn't all come together. And it's really, that's the cult within a cult. So you had L. Ron Hubbard forming a cult. And this has happened throughout history. One of the other great cult leaders was a man named Manny, who was in about the 2nd century AD. He founded Manichaeism. And the similarities to L. Ron Hubbard are mind-boggling. He thought he was the Buddha, okay? All these guys think they're the Buddha. I don't know why, but they do. And eventually what happened to Manichaeism was the same thing. It broke into cults within cults. And so you have within Scientology a cult within a cult.
Well, that kind of wraps it up. And I appreciate you coming on, George.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm looking at the screen now, Sean. Is that what the public is seeing?
No.
Okay. Because on my screen, I see some stuff there that shouldn't be there. But anyway, look, and Sean has something to say, but I want to say this, though, before you get into what you're going to say. Let's say Scientology goes by the wayside. If you think that's the end of cults, you're dreaming. You're dreaming. These are going to pop up just as sure as the sun is going to come up every day. And if you take to heart some of the things that I've been saying on this program, and especially other people have been saying, and develop an awareness as to whether you're getting conned or somebody you're talking to has your best welfare or your worst welfare, you're going to fall prey to these things. So I really say to you, continue to listening to this and go by your own judgment and your gut feelings. Okay. Now, Sean, you had something to say. So
yep. Room 111 photography for $5 says Ron and George. Thank you. It takes courage to do what you do.
And what's his name?
It's looks like in a company account. Room 111 photography.
Room 111 photography. I thank you for the kind words. It's very much appreciated. And all of you out there, remember, 2 weeks from now, we're going to have patrons only, I guess, a little rap session here. So I invite you to join. If you haven't become a Patreon, please go ahead and do so. Your help is very much appreciated. It is the thing that helps us with the ongoingness. And by the way, I love that word, the ongoingness. You know, I don't know if that word exists, but it kind of describes what I'm talking about. You know what I mean, George?
Yes, I do. That's a good. Hey, Blavatsky created beingness and all those knowingness and all those other things.
Wow.
He just borrowed them. Yeah.
Okay, well,
She has that in her books. Yeah.
A modern day of Polish ancestry, Ron Miscavige created the word ongoingness.
Ongoingness. There you go.
That may be bullshit, but I'm claiming that I coined that word, the ongoingness. Anyway, for all of you who have watched this and continue to watch it, I appreciate it, and I appreciate it if you tell other people to watch this program, so we can get more and more and more people being enlightened. And I especially want to thank you, George. I thank you very much, and I apologize for the delay we had and all this goddamn stuff with sound. I'll tell you, the only thing that can stop us is computers. It's terrible, but it could be ignorance of being experts at it. But at any rate, George, I thank you very much. And anytime you want to come back and maybe discuss some other part of it, you're welcome. Just give me a buzz and we'll go over it and fit you in. Okay, George?
Yes, great. And thank you very much for the opportunity. And this had to come out at this particular point in time. There's no way around it. And that's why I just bellied up to the bar and did it. And I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. And I appreciate having you on. So
thank you.
For all of you out there, this is Life After Scientology. I'm Ron Miscavige, and I'll see you on the next episode. Remember, next week, Mike Rinder. 2 weeks from now, the Patron Hangout.
All right. Great. Yeah, thank that. Oh. I'm on my way.